Ever get that feeling? Like you're super curious about something, but digging through all the info to get to the good stuff, ugh, it can be so overwhelming.
Oh, tell me about it.
Well, today we've done the digging for you. Literally, we're going deep into ancient food secrets, all hidden in plain sight on some pretty basic stone tools.
Basic, but they hold so much information.
Right. You sent us some awesome research on this, and honestly, it'll change the way you think about the past. Ready to time travel?
Always. Let's go.
Okay, so we're talking ancient kitchens, right?
Hmm.
And the star of the show today is something called a bedrock metate.
You got it.
Now, quick refresher. Picture a moneno. That's the handheld stone for grinding. And the metate, that's the bigger surface it's grinding against.
Like a mortar and pestle, kind of?
Exactly. But here's the thing. Bedrock metates, those are ground right into big, exposed rock out in the open.
Part of the landscape, yeah.
And get this, some are like 15,500 years old.
It's mind-blowing, right? These tools were used for so long, and they're just packed with info.
They've just been sitting there, waiting for us to unlock their secrets.
And speaking of unlocking secrets, that's where places like the Natural History Museum of Utah come in.
They're doing some really cool stuff.
Cutting edge, really. New techniques to extract these tiny plant bits that have been stuck in the stone for, well, forever.
It's like time travel in a lab.
For sure.
So our main detectives in this story are Stefania Wilks. She's an archaeobotanist, meaning she studies ancient plants.
A plant detective.
Exactly. And Lisbeth Louderback, she's the curator of archaeology at that museum in Utah.
Great team.
They're focused on these microscopic starch granules stuck in those bedrock metates all over Western North America.
Tiny but mighty, those granules.
Okay, so why are these tiny bits of starch so important?
Well, think of them as a plant's energy snack pack. Pure carbs.
Carbs from thousands of years ago. Whoa.
Right. And here's the amazing part. Even if the plant itself disappears over time, these starch granules, they're tough.
They don't give up.
Nope. They get lodged in those little cracks and crevices in the stone tools, and they survive.
So they're like direct evidence of what people were eating way back then.
Exactly. A food journal written in stone, basically.
Wow. And how did those granules get into the stone in the first place? Was it just like an accident?
Not at all. It's all about the grinding. People would mash and grind their food on those metates, and that force, it pushed those starch granules deep into the rock.
Like they were embedding them on purpose.
In a way, yeah. That's like they were preserving them for us to find thousands of years later.
That's incredible. So when we're picturing these bedrock metates, what are we talking about? Just like a dent in a rock?
They're more than just dents. They come in different shapes. Some are long grooves, kind of oval-shaped, worn into sandstone. Others are rounder, like bowls. And sometimes you find them deep and round, almost like a mortar, for pounding.
So variety in the kitchen tools.
Definitely. And here's another interesting thing. You rarely find just one by itself. Usually they're in groups or even lined up, almost like a prehistoric food court.
A Stone Age food prep area.
Exactly. I know a rock with a dent might not seem exciting compared to, say, a beautifully crafted arrowhead, but Stefania Wilks, the researcher we talked about, she said these seemingly simple tools tell us so much about what people were eating.
More than meets the eye, right?
For sure.
To really picture all this, let's look at some research from Southern Oregon.
Okay.
It's a really interesting area with basalt, rock formations, petroglyphs, those rock carvings. And it has a lot of these geophytes.
Geophytes, that's a new one.
Right, sorry. Plants with starchy underground parts, roots, tubers, bulbs, like that.
Ah, okay, got it.
So for a long time, people thought those uplands were mainly for hunting.
Makes sense, right? Wide open spaces.
But Wilks and Louderback's team had a different question.
What's that?
Could those bedrock metates up there have been for processing plants, specifically those starchy geophytes?
Interesting. So not just hunting grounds, but maybe a prehistoric pantry?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway here. Those areas might have been much more important for plant-based food than we thought.
Challenging assumptions. I like it.
And their research methods were really interesting. They didn't just glance at the metates, they got up close and personal.
Oh, yeah.
They scrubbed the surface with an electric toothbrush and water to collect anything loose.
Making sure they got everything.
Then they use a deflocculant. It's like a gentle soap to help loosen up the particles really stuck in the stone.
Clever.
Then out comes the electric toothbrush again to get that stuff out of the cracks.
Thorough. I like it.
Oh, and very important, they did the same thing to nearby rocks that didn't look used.
Ah, the control group. Essential.
Right. Gotta compare. So after all that microscopic CSI work, what did they find?
Well, the samples from the metaxy surfaces and those control rocks, practically no starch granules.
Interesting.
But the samples from deep inside those used metats, hundreds of starch granules.
So they knew they had starch. But what kind of plants were we talking about? That sounds tricky.
It was a puzzle, for sure. They had to compare the size and shape of those ancient granules with modern plant starches.
Like a microscopic matching game.
Exactly.
And they were able to match some of them up.
They were. They found evidence of the carrot family, including biscuitroot. That was a big one.
Secret root, okay.
They also found starches from wild grasses, probably wild rye, and some from the lily family, too.
Lilies, huh?
And here's the key. These weren't just random plants. They were all important food sources for indigenous groups who lived in these areas. Then, and in many cases, now.
It's like a direct line to the past through their food.
It really is.
Now, there was that article you mentioned earlier in American Antiquity. It goes deep on one specific plant, biscuitroot, in Warner Valley, Oregon. Why was that study so important?
Biscuitroot, or Lomatium, is a really interesting case. First off, it grows like crazy in that area, right near those sites.
Convenient.
Right. And there's a ton of information about how indigenous communities used it, and it's super nutritious.
So it ticks all the boxes.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that biscuitroot is a geophyte, right? What makes those so special?
Geophytes are like the ultimate survivors. They're perennials, meaning they come back year after year, and they store all their energy underground in their roots, tubers, or bulbs.
Smart.
Right. And they're packed with good stuff, carbs, fiber, vitamins, minerals, the works,
Nature's energy bars.
basically. And for hunter-gatherers, they were a super reliable food source, especially in places where other foods are hard to come by.
Like a backup pantry in the ground.
Exactly.
And for indigenous communities in the northern Great Basin, those geophytes were way more than just food. They were part of their identity.
Absolutely. They were woven into their rituals, stories, traditions. They were, and still are, incredibly important.
Which makes finding physical evidence of their use so important.
Mm.
But if the plants themselves decompose, how do we do that?
That's where these starch granules come in. They're like tiny time capsules preserving that evidence for us.
In that Warner Valley research, they found those granules on the Bedrock Metates.
Yeah. Right. And that area is full of other archaeological stuff, too. Rock art, those rock rings we talked about, and other stone tools.
It's like a whole ancient toolkit.
And it paints a picture of a landscape that was actively used and managed. And remember those rock art sites? The researchers had a theory about them.
Oh, right. They thought those sites weren't just placed randomly. They were put near important plant communities on purpose.
Exactly. They were processing those plants right there, and finding those bedrock metates nearby just makes sense, right?
Like set up your kitchen next to your grocery store.
Yeah.
Super efficient.
Exactly. So back to biscuitroot, Lomatium. What do we know about how it was traditionally used?
Well, it's part of the carrot family.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of different types all over Western North America. They like those areas between the foothills and the mountains.
Okay.
And they went for those fleshy taproots. Pounded and ground them into dried cakes.
Ah, for storage. Smart.
Right. So they could have food all year round. They'd harvest in the spring using digging sticks when the flower stalks popped up.
A sign that the roots were ready.
Exactly. They knew their plants. And there's this thing called traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. It shows how important biscuitroot was. At least 14 different types were used as food in the Pacific Northwest.
Wow, 14.
Some think it might have been a huge part of their diet, maybe even 30% of all the geophytes they ate.
That's a lot.
It was a staple. And get this, there's some evidence that indigenous harvesting practices actually helped those plants thrive.
Really?
Yeah. They'd focus on dense patches and leave others alone. It might have actually made the plants healthier over time.
So it wasn't just taking, it was giving back, helping the plants flourish.
Exactly. Sustainable harvesting.
I love that.
And those biscuitroot roots were packed with calories, right?
Oh yeah, very energy rich. Some say a good forager could get a whole year's worth for their family in just a short time.
So really important for survival. Now back to those bedrock metates. They're often kind of shallow, right? Would that have been good for processing biscuitroot?
That shape would have been perfect for grinding and pounding those roots. And we've talked about research on groundstone tools that were dug up from sites, but those bedrock metates, the ones just sitting out in the open, they haven't gotten as much attention. This new research is changing that. Those open-air kitchens have secrets to spill.
They've been waiting to tell their story.
They have, and they don't just tell us about food, they give us clues about how people live, their social structures, all kinds of things.
It's like each metate is a window to the past.
Exactly, and it's all thanks to those tiny starch granules trapped in the stone for thousands of years. It's amazing what survives.
Truly. You mentioned earlier that other research on groundstone tools has also shown how important geophytes were.
Yeah,
Can you give us some examples?
absolutely. There was a study at North Creek Shelter in Utah. They found starch from native potato to going back almost 11,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah, really old. And at Hogup Cave, also in Utah, they found starch from various geophytes on tools from the early Holocene.
So pretty early on, people were using these plants.
It seems so. And in the Wyoming Basin, they found evidence of spring parsley processing between about 9,400 and 400 years ago, all from grinding tools.
It's all adding up to a clearer picture of how people use these plants across Western North America.
Piece by piece, we're building that picture. And this Warner Valley study, it adds a whole new layer, focusing on those open-air bedrock metates.
Right. So how do they actually do this study? What was the process?
Well, they sampled 58 bedrock metates at 3 different rock art sites in Warner Valley.
Okay.
Coral Lake, Berry Spring, and Long Lake, all on basalt outcrops near those temporary lakes and springs.
So places with water. Makes sense.
Right. And they paid close attention to the patina on the metates, that weathered surface that forms on rock over time.
Like a natural layer of history.
Exactly. And whether there were signs of the grinding surfaces being reused on top of that patina.
It's trying to figure out how old those surfaces were.
Exactly. They also collected modern starch granules from local Lomatium species, so they had something to compare their samples to. And they did that 2-step sampling process we talked about. First, surface wash, then that deeper extraction using a special solution.
Get all those stubborn granules.
You got it. Then, in the lab, they sieved, centrifuged, and did all kinds of fancy stuff to isolate those starch granules.
Lab magic.
Pretty much. And finally, they looked at them under a microscope and took photos.
So what did they find after all that work? What was the big reveal?
Well, they found Lomatium starch and starch from other plants in the carrot family on both those patinated surfaces and the reused ones. And interestingly, the reused surfaces had more starch.
More use, more starch. Makes sense.
Right. And those deep down samples from most of the metates, they had starch granules, and a good chunk were Lomatium or other carrot family members. But like they expected, those control samples and surface washes, hardly any starch.
So it really pointed to those metates being used for processing those specific plants.
Exactly. They also found starch from other plants, like wild rye, but a lot of the granules were too damaged to identify. That happens over time.
Ah, the ravages of time. But still, finding that Lomatium starch on metates right next to rock art, that's a pretty big deal, right?
It's a smoking gun, basically. It
Wow.
shows they were processing a locally available, culturally important geophyte right there. And when you add in all the other archaeological evidence, like those Great Basin-carved abstract rock art and Western-stemmed projectile points.
Which are all pretty old, right?
Exactly. It suggests people were using these areas for plant processing for a very long time, maybe even since the end of the last ice age.
So we might not know exactly how old each metate is, but the big picture is clear.
The evidence points to long-term use. And remember, processing a lot of food in one place usually means groups of people were involved. And those bedrock metates, they're often found at the biggest rock art sites in Warner Valley.
So it all fits together. These weren't just random spots. They chose them for a reason, to be near those important plants.
It's like a prehistoric map of food and culture.
Amazing how it all connects. And this isn't just ancient history, right? These geophytes are still important to Indigenous communities today.
So important. They're still harvested, and those root-digging camps are still a place to gather and pass down traditional knowledge.
It's like a living connection to the past.
It really is.
And we talked about tech, traditional ecological knowledge. How does this research relate to that and to things like Indigenous food sovereignty?
It's a perfect example of how archaeology can back up and enhance tech. Indigenous communities didn't just take from the land, they shaped it.
They were active participants.
Exactly. They managed those resources, often making them even better. And this research, it helps us understand that long relationship between people and plants. And that can inform how we manage public lands, how we think about food sovereignty.
It's about respecting those traditional practices and protecting those important habitats.
Exactly. Those landscapes aren't untouched wilderness. They have a human story going back generations.
And we need to remember that.
We do. And we need to remember that those metates and rock art are on sacred ground, cared for by the Klamath, Modoc, and Pirate peoples for generations.
Their stewardship is so important.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these ancient stone kitchens, what's the big takeaway? What should we remember?
For me, it's the realization that something as simple as grinding food on a stone can leave behind a record that lasts for millennia.
A record that tells us so much about how people lived and what they ate.
Exactly. And it shows their deep connection to plants, especially geophytes like biscuitroot. It wasn't just about survival, it was about culture, identity, community.
It's a story told through microscopic clues, connecting us to the past in a way we never thought possible.
It bridges the gap between archaeology and living traditions, highlighting the importance of multiple perspectives when we study the past.
It really makes you think. What will our own kitchens tell future archaeologists? What traces will we leave behind?
What secrets will our countertops reveal?
It's a humbling thought, right? It reminds us that we're all part of this long, ongoing story of humans and the natural world. And our choices today will become the archaeology of tomorrow.
That's a powerful way to put it.
It's about recognizing that connection, respecting the past, and being mindful of the future. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder your own kitchen secrets. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
Until next time.